All right, it looks to me like we have everyone in the room and out of the waiting room. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my introductory remarks here. So good afternoon. I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is a status conference on water right application 30166 filed by El Sur Ranch for a permit to appropriate water from the Big Sur River in Monterey County. This status conference is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording along with the Zoom generated transcript to the AHO FTP site for this matter. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If at any time you are experiencing technical difficulties trying to communicate with us today, please send an email to the AHO at adminhrgoffice@waterboards.ca.gov. AHO staff will be monitoring the email inbox. Assisting me today are several staff of the Administrative Hearings Office. We have Nicole Mullen, Amy Blunk, Skylar Anderson, and Kyle Wooldridge. I'd like to go ahead and move to appearances. To do that, I will identify each of the entities who have filed NOIs. And as I do, if you are representing that entity today, please unmute your microphone and state your name. As we proceed, please keep your microphone muted except when you're speaking so that we can minimize background noise. So I will begin with the applicant, El Sur Ranch, and James J. Hill III.
This is Tom Berliner.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Berliner.
Mark Blum, also present for El Sur Ranch.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Blum.
Good afternoon.
And Julianne Ainsley. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Ainsley. Thank you. I will then move to California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance.
Good afternoon, Chris Schutz for the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good to see you again, Mr. Schutz. Center for Biological Diversity. Do I have Mr. Buse or Mr. Broderick?
I don't know what became of them. I had not heard that they weren't planning to attend, but I'll certainly keep them informed of anything that occurs if they don't join.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schutz. I appreciate that. Do I have Ventana Wilderness Alliance? Trout Unlimited. Carmel River Steelhead Association. Monterey Waterkeeper. And I think this one I'll get a hit, I think. California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Good afternoon, Kathleen Miller for CDFW.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Miller. And we received your notification regarding the change in representation, and so we've modified our service list accordingly. Thank you. And then California Department of Parks and Recreation.
Good afternoon, Emma Severson for California State Parks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Severson. And National Marine Fisheries Service.
Good afternoon, Joel Casagrande, NOAA Fisheries.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Casagrande. Is there anyone else here who plans to participate who has not had a chance to introduce themselves? All right, I'll jump right in. I think this will be a short status conference today, but here's what I have on my agenda. First of all, I'll note that the AHO did receive comments on the applicant's draft amended application and petition, and we received those from CDFW, California State Parks, and the CSPA, Center for Biological Diversity, and Ventana Wilderness Alliance groups. We can call that, I think you're referring to yourselves as the conservation groups, so that's fine. I did want to give Mr. Berliner an opportunity to comment if he would like, or on the comments that were received and whether that will affect the application and submittal of that application. I'd like to talk a little bit about a deadline for submitting a final version of the application and petition to the Division of Water Rights, when we can expect that, and I do want to set a deadline for that. And then I thought we should talk also about the next steps in terms of developing whatever additional CEQA documentation will need to accompany the amended application I would like to discuss that as well and some possible timelines for how the next steps in that process. Then we can turn to anything else that anyone would like to raise, and we will also be setting up a follow-up status conference down the road. So that's my brief version of the agenda. I'll turn to you first, Mr. Berliner. Is there anything, I think we can rope the first two together. If there anything you would like to say in terms of the comments that were received, and then when might we expect you would be ready to submit a final version of that application and petition? And I believe you're still on mute.
Yeah.
There we go.
Hi, got it? Great. We did receive those comments, and I have turned those over to Provost and Pritchard, the company that's preparing the application. I've not heard anything back from them to indicate that there was anything of any particular difficulty in the comments that were raised. So I believe that they are, to the best of my knowledge, based on a conversation I had with them several days ago, proceeding to address the issues that were raised. I mean, obviously, some of the issues were not on point to the application itself. So those are not being addressed by Provost and Pritchard. But as to those that are actually germane to the application, those are being reviewed, and I expect to get a redraft from them probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. That'll give us a chance to go over it and get it back to them for finalization.
So when, I know you mentioned 2 to 3 weeks, but if I were to be setting a deadline for the applicant to submit a final version to the division, what deadline would you propose?
Let me look at the calendar just to give you a specific date. I would subject just to check with them. I would propose March 3rd.
Okay. And I realize, you know, you might consult with your consultant if there's a good reason. I will plan to set a date of March 3rd, but if there's good cause to make a change, you can certainly submit something.
Okay.
And we can talk
Thank
about
you.
that. I think the appropriate procedure would be to file it with the division as you would normally, because they have their intake process that they
Yes.
use. And that would be the best way, and then file a copy. Well, send a copy to the service list.
Yes.
The digital version. That would be great. Is there anything else you want to comment on this piece before we start talking about CEQA?
I don't think so.
I'll look to the room then. Are there any other comments on this deadline for submitting a final version of the application petition? Now, I do want to note, I realize the comments I thought were substantive, they were productive, they identified the different parties' position. This is just, we're in the amended application hasn't even been submitted at this point. So there will certainly be other opportunities to raise objections and concerns. It's not as if we receive the comments and just move on without necessarily addressing them. They will be addressed. This was just an initial opportunity for the parties to have a conversation and engage with the applicant before that final version is submitted. So with those comments, I'll look to the room. Mr. Buse, I see you joined us. Would you like to maybe just introduce yourself, get on camera so we can get you in here for the record? And if you have any comments, you may make those, and then I'll turn to the rest of the room.
I don't have a camera handy, but hopefully the audio is working okay.
Audio is fine. Audio is fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is John Bussey from the Center for Biological Diversity and on behalf of the conservation organizations. But yeah, thank you. And I had nothing further to add beyond that.
Thank you. And I apologize for mispronouncing your name, Mr. Bussey. I will
Yeah,
look
no
to the
problem.
rest-
Thank you.
Thanks. I will look to the rest of the room. Does anyone else have comments just on what we've discussed so far? All right, then I wanted to turn to the CEQA issue. I've been thinking about this a little more. I think, and enjoying the CEQA guidelines. In my read of the CEQA guidelines, it looks to me like what we're talking about is a recirculation of a portion of the EIR, because we got as far as a final EIR, and then which was never certified, and now we have changes to the project. So my initial reading was that what we'd be doing would be recirculating portions of the EIR that would be affected by the changes, including the addition of the reservoir. But I think the thing to do, Mr. Berliner, is to look to your consultants, which I don't know if it's going to be Provost and Pritchard, if they do that, do CEQA type documents, but look to your consultants to maybe make a recommendation, I'll call it a recommendation on what they think is appropriate to amend the CEQA document. What is it that we're going to be doing to change the CEQA document to account for the changes in the project? And then we could meet, via status conference and come to an understanding of what it is we're doing, whether it's a recirculation of a portion of the EIR or something else, and then maybe what portions of the EIR, generally speaking, would need to be recirculated and what portions would remain the same. Do you have any comments on that, Mr. Berliner, about our next steps for CEQA?
So I have, since we did not go to since the final wasn't adopted, it struck me that it was either, as you indicated, a recirculation of the draft focusing on certain sections, or a supplemental. And since we didn't, normally a supplemental is done after you've got a final, so I didn't think that applied. So I too thought that essentially it would be a revised draft that focuses specifically on the new matters. We haven't formally hired a consultant, but I did speak to Horizon. They've done work for the Water Board and thought they might be appropriate. They are familiar with the Central Coast. And so I thought, well, we've got an entity. I mean, Provost and Pritchard can do it as well, but I thought since they're potentially an advocate for us, that it would be better to take an independent provider. And so I located Horizon, and given their experience on the Central Coast, I thought they would be appropriate. I know they've done some stuff on other rivers in California as well, so they have that experience. And I spoke to them several weeks ago about doing the work. They have the ability to do it. I have never been in this position. However, with the Water Board, I've been engaged in lots and lots of EIRs that the Water Board has done, but I've never been the applicant who's charged with preparing the draft. And so I'm not really familiar with how this needs to work. And if there was somebody that I could talk to just kind of walk me through it to make sure that I'm just concerned about procedurally, what the Water Board will want, if anything, or do we just show up with a revised draft? I mean, I understand, I heard what you said, we'll all talk about what needs to be revised, but if there's something I have to do or Horizon has to do, they probably know, but I don't.
So thank you, Mr. Berliner. This is really helpful. I too am in this unique position. I'm not sure the Water Board has regularly been in a situation where the board has asked an applicant to prepare an EIR in a in a position in which the board was not directly controlling the content on a kind of a day-to-day direct basis. I think we're going to have to, when I was thinking about this in preparation for the status conference was, we'll take it one step at a time. It may be that we need to get to a point where certain staff of the board have to separate functions out of this and could provide input, but again, that input would be separate from the decision-making process that we're going through the hearing. So I don't know if that'd be valuable or not. The other, what I've really been thinking is we may just have regular status conferences where I can bring in staff through the status conference who have experience and we can just have a conversation. It doesn't need to be quite as formal as the way we've been conducting these. We can sit around the table on Zoom, so to speak, and have a conversation about what needs to be done. And the other parties would of course have the opportunity to be in the room with us, the virtual room with us, while we have these conversations about how the CEQA document would move forward. But my thinking is now is to look at the immediate steps, which is to get a consultant in place and then have an initial assessment of what it is that needs to be done in terms of the content. And then you're right, I think we need to talk about process. I myself have questions about AB 52 tribal consultation. I think that may be triggered. I mean, there's certain public noticing. If we're recirculating a portion of the draft EIR, I think there's public noticing requirements that would need to be met and would, because the board is the lead agency, we'd probably be in, we would need to be in a role of doing some of that. But I'd like to see how we will handle it through this office. So it's a little bit of an exploratory mission, but I would like to kind of work through it incrementally for now, if that makes sense to you. And if we can get your consultant on board and ideally set up a status conference where we can meet and discuss some of these issues, that may be the best way to do it. So at this time, that's my thinking. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I don't. I really kind of thought we just kind of need to talk about it, and since this is sort of unique, in, dealing with the AHO, because normally the consultant would talk directly with water board staff, and they would be working together and doing what needed to get done, and then this is a little bit different. So,
right.
I don't have any particular thoughts other than normally the consultant would pick up the phone and talk to the person they need to talk to. And I don't know how that's going to work here. I'm comfortable with them doing that. I have confidence that, just going through the normal channels would be fine, but I don't want to run afoul of our procedures here either. So I want to make sure that everybody understands, that Horizon would have their marching orders and what they can and can't do. And the other participants are comfortable that, what's going on is appropriate. And of course, AHO as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for now, we're not going to solve this today. But the next step, it sounds like, is to retain a consultant on your end. So yep. What if I were to set a deadline for that? What do you think would be an appropriate deadline for retaining the consultant and then beginning those conversations between the applicant and the consultant about what the project is, what might be required in terms of revising the existing EIR draft and final EIR that we have?
Well, in terms of hiring the consultant, assuming that the right people are available to talk to me at Horizon, that should probably take, a week to 10 days.
Okay.
But in terms of the remainder of that discussion, I don't know what their schedule is. I don't know how impacted they are. I did ask them if they had the capacity to take this on, which they indicated they did. Mm-hmm. But since we're now, right at ground level on doing this, before it was, off in the distance.
Right.
And so at this point, I would need to check with them on their availability, but I would think, in order to get, if we're going to be having a status conference to address all of this, then I think we're going to need to have the consultant on board with the right people, so they can sit in on the status conference and be part of the discussion, which means we need to brief them first on the overall project, get them up to speed so they at least have enough understanding to talk about it. Then we need to have the status conference, and then they need to go back and think about it and get back to us with how long they think that'll take.
Right.
So that's kind of a process. Assuming that they're available, I would expect I could have them under contract in about 10 days. So probably another week or so after that in order to get them up to speed. And then we could have a status conference.
So here's what I think, Mr. Berliner. This is good. We're looking at, we already talked about March 3rd as a deadline to submit the revised amended application and petition. I'll set a deadline of March 3rd to retain the consultant just because that's convenient, but it sounds like you may be able to do that much sooner. And then what do you think about looking to sometime in mid-March to actually hold a status conference? And not necessarily
well-
solve these issues, but start to at least have an initial conversation with the consultant there, and we can see what it is that we need to pin down.
So I'm going to be unavailable from about March 7th to 20th.
Okay.
So unfortunately, I can't do it mid-March.
Well, we could let's look at the week of the 20th. With that, do you have openings on your schedule for the week of the 20th? And I'm going to turn to the room. We're not making any final
Sure.
decisions, but
Yeah, late that week would be fine.
okay. So let me turn to the room to see if anyone has any comments on the next steps that Mr. Berliner and I have outlined. The deadline of March 3rd for the applicant to retain a CEQA consultant, and then returning for a status conference the week of March 20th. I'll try to lay out in any ruling what it is we would be discussing, at least my sense of what we would be discussing. But it's just to get us all oriented, as I understand, to get us all oriented about what changes would be needed to be made to this final EIR, uncertified, unadopted final EIR that we have, and how we're going to move forward with an appropriate public process for developing that, the additional documentation. So I'll look, does anyone have any comments on those issues? Mr. Schutz, I'm going to pick on you just because it's unlike you to be quiet, but you don't have any comments here. I meant that in a nice way.
Yeah, it is kind of out of character. There you go. I just hope that at some point today we'll get to the question of how you're going to sequence any call for protests, if you are going to request those, with the EIR, how other proceedings will be going on, specific to the AHO and the outstanding unresolved issues, and how all these things are going to sequence and overlap. So I was holding my fire until we came to what I hoped would address those kinds of issues after the more narrow question of a status conference specifically for CEQA.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. I think that is, I did not have that on my agenda, and I think that is an appropriate topic. I don't know how far we'll get today because I haven't had a chance to think about it in detail, but as I understand it, what you're laying out is the issue of how we're going to take, not only move forward on CEQA, but then take our additional next steps on noticing the amended application and petition and the process for submitting protests to that and the re-noticing process associated with that, which I didn't lay out today. So I think from my point of view, I think that is homework for the AHO. To lay out what I see as the process once the revised amended application is actually filed on before or by March 3rd. And then put that in writing, and then that maybe is something we would address in more detail. If there are questions, concerns, whatever it is, we could address at this March 20th status conference. Do you think that, does that make sense to you?
You're asking almost the only non-lawyer in the room, but it does, it makes sense to me, yes.
That's a
I
good
won't
start.
vouch for its
Sense to
validity.
I will, is there anything else you'd like to add, Mr. Schutz? I don't mean to cut you off.
No, thank you.
I will look to the room. I'll get back to you, Mr. Berliner, on this issue. But to the rest of the room, are there any comments on either a conversation about CEQA or this addition to the conversation about the process for re-noticing or noticing the amended application and petition? Mr. Berliner, I'll turn back to you. Do you have any comments on the homework that I laid out for me, which is to identify what I see as the next procedural steps for the board in noticing the amended application, putting that in writing so that we're all clear as to what direction the AHO is intending to go, and then we can address that issue further if needed at our next status conference. Does that make sense to you, Mr. Berliner?
It does, and candidly, I assumed it was going to follow the direction that came over from the water board to the AHO as to what the issues are. So in terms of renote, I mean, that's what we focused on, is those issues, and that's what we were planning to address in terms of the application and CEQA analysis. So it would be, you know, consistent with that. Those are the unresolved issues. Well, let me state that a little differently. It's more succinctly stated as we would be addressing the issues that are in the draft. The two unresolved issues that are in the settlement agreement, as well as the quote resolved issues that are in the settlement agreement.
I think,
And then to the extent that would be part of the revised application, obviously.
and I would just want to take a moment to clarify, because we may be talking about two different things. My understanding of what I was talking about is the notice process, the formal notice process that I think the board needs to undertake for purposes of the amended application and petition, because the changes are significant enough to trigger a requirement to renotice. I don't know if it's a renotice or to notice the changes that occurred and receive any additional protests with respect to those specific changes. Then there's the other question of, once we get to the point of conducting a hearing, supplemental hearing, what are the issues on the table for purposes of that hearing? And I think that's kind of a separate noticing process that we would go through when the time came.
Yes.
Does that clarification fit with your understanding?
Yes.
Okay, good. So at this time, what I want to do is lay out what I see the process is for the documents that are coming in, the petition, the amended application, who it is that we think need, lay out who it is that we think have to be noticed, how, what is it that the AHO or the division is going to do, and then what is going to be the process for receiving protests, and what is the appropriate scope of the issues that can be protested through this particular process.
That sounds right.
Before we go to our calendars, are there any other issues that we should talk about today before we set this status conference? I'm tentatively looking at the week of March 20th. Does anyone want to raise anything else?
Ms. Kenzie, I have one other thing that I think you should take on as part of the AHO's homework,
Please.
which is sort of figuring out if and when mediation falls into this picture.
Yes, thank you,
And-
Mr. Schutz. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Right, and what the scope of it would be.
Yes.
I think there's some disagreement reviewing the different submittals that came in as to what is resolved, what is not resolved, what is contested, what is not contested, and so forth. And I think we need some guidance on that type of issue.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. Mediation, I know that's on the table. I didn't mean to. It's still certainly in my mind, and it sounds like it may be productive in this case. The reason I hadn't raised it at this time, there's just to be transparent with with the parties, is that we're having some changes in the staffing here at the Administrative Hearings Office. So I would like to wait until those settle down so that I can understand better what it is that can be offered in terms of mediation. So it's a little bit of a hold. It's something that I would like to figure out, but we also are going through a little bit of some changes, which will settle down and we'll figure out. So thank you, Mr. Schutz, for keeping that on my radar, and it still is on my radar, even if not for today. Anything else before we turn to the calendars? All right, I'm looking at the week of March 20th. I think I'd like to start with the proposal of Wednesday, March 22nd in the afternoon, again at 1 p.m. But I will look to the room. I could also do March 23rd and if necessary, March 24th. Those are open. But is there the initial proposal of March 22nd at 1 p.m.? Is there anyone who has an unresolvable conflict with that?
I don't have an unresolvable conflict, but the 21st will be my first day back. And so frankly, if I could have a couple of days back before we do this, that would be beneficial.
Also, this is John Bussey. I have a not entirely unresolvable conflict on the 21st, but a conflict nonetheless. If it would work better for Mr. Berliner as well, the following week would work better for me as well.
All right, let me see what I have here. I have the following week is difficult for the AHO's schedule. Let me go back to, would Mr. Berliner, would the morning of March 24th be preferable to you?
Yes, actually the 24th, anytime from 10 onwards is fine.
Okay. So we could do a 10 a.m. start, but I will look to the room. Mr. Bussey, I'm not sure this solves your preferences, but
it doesn't wholly, but I will try to be available during that time.
okay. Is there anyone else who has a conflict with March 24th at 10 a.m.? All right, you can expect to see a status conference notice for me, and in that it may take a little bit because I will try to lay out some of these issues, the homework for the
Oh,
AHO.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. My colleague Jolianne Ainsley can't make it on the 24th.
Ah.
Does the
I'm sorry.
23rd work?
We were texting and I was trying to make him aware of that.
Do it quickly. No problem. I'm glad I didn't move too quickly.
I didn't want to
um,
cross him. The 23rd would be fine if it's fine with other parties.
We can do the 23rd. Once again, I prefer the afternoon at 1 p.m. unless there are conflicts. Would 1 p.m. on the 23rd work for everyone? And please feel free to speak up if you have a conflict. All right, let's do March 23rd at 1 p.m. for our next status conference. And as I said, you can expect to see a notice from me setting that status conference. I'll also attempt to address some of the AHO's homework in that notice so that you will have plenty of time to take a look at it and respond and prepare for that March 23rd conference. And I look forward to seeing the final submittals by March 3rd. I will set those deadlines as well. And with that, I think we have addressed everything. Thank you for joining me. This was short but productive, I think, and I appreciate it. And I will see all of you on March 23rd.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.